afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Take your seats for this session, which is for a burning issue of the day, reducing debt. And I'm delighted to be here to moderate this session. We've got a whole time for questions and answers with the floor, but I will start with our panel. I'm a journalist with the French TV station LTE. I call it Isabelle GOUNIN-LEVY. We're going to hear from, first of all, from Jean-Paulin, Coordinateur. You're a specialist in banking and finance. You're a professor at the University of Orléans, and of course, a member of the Cercle des Économistes. So we're delighted that you are here with us for this session. We also have Gérard BEKERMAN next to me. He is chair of the French Savers and Investors Union. We've got Sarah CARLSON, your Senior Vice President of Moody's Rating Sovereign Risk. We're looking forward to hearing you. Salim, CHAHINE, your Vice Governor of the Central Bank of Lebanon. Next to Sarah, you've got CHENUT. You are Chair of the French Mutuality. And then you also have Jakob von WEIZSÄCKER. You are Minister of Finance and Science of the Saar region in Germany. So we've got a full panel, and we're going to start with Jean-Paul Pollin to just introduce the debate to us. Are you in agreement with the idea that we need to reduce debt, whatever it takes? Or maybe you want to have some other ideas, maybe you're not in agreement with that. Thank you. Thank you very much, Isabelle. We know that over the last 15 years, advanced developed countries generally have doubled the level of debt that they owe. It's a bit of a problem, of course, because that leaves very little leeway for future crises if they were to occur. But the most serious thing here is that these particular countries are facing a huge range of investments that they need to make. First of all, investments in the green transition. There are also technological transitions going on, and our countries are also needing to increase their military spending to rearm. And for some of these countries, they are also seeking to rehabilitate their public goods and services. In these circumstances, to say that we're going to reduce debt seems fairly tricky or maybe even provocative. The debt level is not necessarily the most important thing. It's not the thing that will endanger or jeopardize our economy. It won't lead to our countries being declared insolvent or the debt level being declared unsustainable. The important thing is the pathway, the trajectory for this debt level. You need to know whether the level of debt is going to keep on growing in an exponential manner, or whether it is going to be starting to stabilize, and the appropriate measures are taken to ensure this stabilization. This trajectory will depend on two simple variables. First of all, the state budget, and then the spread between the interest rate on that debt and the growth rate, the gap between those two rates. If we believe that interest rates are not going to fall to the abnormally low rates that they were at in the past, what that means is that we will need to play with these budget deficits, reduce them, but not at the same time, make sure that at the same time we don't reduce the growth rate, because if the growth rate were to fall, this would have a negative effect on this debt stabilization trajectory I was talking about. This is nonetheless possible because we could focus on the efficiency of public spending. We could play with the tax system and adjust it, but we need to do that without affecting growth rates. It's going to be tricky, and it will be costly from a social and political point of view. So one might ask that whether the best solution might not be to go for growth, perhaps even taking the risk of taking on further debt in order to fund investments that will bring growth and to ensure that we get onto this pathway to stabilizing debt that I was talking about. So this is not necessarily something that will be easy to do. It won't be free of charge. It needs to be credible both in the eyes of the markets and the eyes of other investors. So there needs to be a very clearly understood strategy that is detailed enough to ensure this, and we also need to ensure on this matter that across Europe there is sufficient aid from our various partners. Thank you very much, Isabelle. Thank you, Jean-Paul. We're going to move on to Sarah CARLSON. Get you to respond to this provocation from Jean-Paul, and when we say should we reduce debt whatever it takes, we could perhaps ask the question, should we increase the debt to stop breaking the cycle of growth? For you, Sarah CARLSON, you think that the link between debt and growth is not necessarily automatic. If you'd allow me, I'm going to answer your question in English. It's an important question.
The world in such a binary way as you choose fundamentally between growth or debt. We have a methodology that we use. We rate over 140 countries around the world, and we apply the same methodology to everyone. And we look at four main factors. We look at a country's economic strength, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in just a second. We look at the strength of its institutions and its governance. We look at the strength of its public finances, and we look at its susceptibility to event risk. But when you take a step back and think about economic strength, this isn't thinking about 1 year's economic forecast or another. Countries go through recessions, they go through normal economic cycles, and it's our practice to look through those. But what we do think about is we think about the long-term structural growth drivers, the structural growth rates that countries can achieve through the cycle. And where does that come from? You know, it comes from having predictable policies. It comes from having sustainable economic and fiscal policies. And if you break it down for those of you who studied economics and you think about the really fundamental growth drivers, there's three things. It comes down to labor. And it's thinking about the size of the labor supply, which means encouraging people to work. It means encouraging women to work. It means encouraging people to remain in the labor force for longer. It means also thinking about the productivity of their work. We think about the productivity of capital. Any of you who have been attending the sessions over the last 2 days have heard people talking about innovation and productivity, and that's extremely important. And that's not necessarily something that comes from the government spending money. That also comes from the investments of the private sector, that comes from research and development, it comes from many sources. And then finally, you think about total factor productivity, which is mathematically a residual, but it's actually extremely important, this residual. And how do countries achieve greater productivity? That's why you often hear me and my colleagues talking about things like structural economic reforms, which are things that help the economy work more efficiently. It helps economies to grow more quickly. That growth doesn't necessarily come quickly. We know from experience that it can take up to 10 years for a country that's embarked on a program of structural reform to actually see the fruits of those reforms. But at the same time, that's the kind of thing that creates sustainable growth. And that is fundamentally what's important from the perspective of ratings, where we're answering quite a very narrow question. I know people focus a lot on it, but we're answering the question of, if you buy a bond, what's the chance that you're going to get your money back? That's the question we answer, and that's why we're thinking about the long term. And it's these long-term economic questions. The government has a lot to do with that, but it doesn't have everything to do with it. And that, of course, we can come on and talk about debt levels later, but I think that's a really important place to start this discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. Salim, CHAHINE, alors on a envie de vous entendre, vous venez du Liban, évidemment.
Salim CHAHINE, you are from Lebanon, and we'd like to hear from you after all that's happened to your country. What is your approach between these different concepts, so growth and debt, and how would you respond to what Jean-Paul Pollin has said to us? Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I'm going to try to respond to Jean-Paul and pick up on some of the things that Sarah has said. Obviously, most countries around the world are trying to strike a balance between balancing their national budgets and reducing debt. But I'll try and answer this question with figures. Sometimes it's better than words. Between 2010 and 2013, world debt increased by from $50 trillion to $150 trillion. The GDP went from $66 trillion and increased by 58%. So the ratio of public debt to GDP went from 70% to 92.4%. We can see the significant change there, but at the same time, the public deficit in terms of GDP terms, it went from 5 to 5.5%. When you look at the cost of the debt as a proportion of GDP, it's around 1.7% of world GDP. That's just to give you a few figures to compare. The world average for spending on health or education compared to GDP is around 3.7 and 4.9%. So there are 3.3 billion people on the Earth where the cost of debt is higher than health and education spending. So that's the pathway that we're on. That's the trajectory that we are on. That's my first comment. My second comment is to say that to strike the balance between fiscal viability and public debt is something that is complex. As you said, there are some pros and cons. Yes, reducing debt is a good thing from a financier's point of view, but when a government decides to reduce public debt, it means there'll be less spending on essential services, education, health and infrastructure, for example. There might be businesses that are affected, rises in unemployment and other social issues, but increasing debt is dangerous when the cost of debt is rising. It has a negative effect on the private sector. There are also eviction effects where the savings and investments are transferred from the private sector to public sector. And there's also a longer-term economic slowdown as a result. So countries have to manage this complexity. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. Despite what people say, we are in a situation which is complex, and we need to find a way to rebalance things gradually in an optimal manner to ensure that governments can meet their short-term needs without affecting their long-term fiscal viability, the sustainable of the business model. Thank you very much. Eric CHENUT, to respond to what's been said, we know that debt is important for you because public spending is very useful. It has a social purpose. So as a chair of the French Mutuality, what would you think? Good afternoon, everybody. I would say there are different kinds of debt. Obviously, you need to look at debt from an economic, fiscal, financial point of view, but you have to look at other types of debt, the ecological debts, the debt in terms of social cohesion. And we're seeing in our country the impact that inequality can have, the fact of declining public services, that can all have an impact. So we need to look at these questions in the round. If we are not careful, major reduction in public investment in infrastructure or preparedness for the major transitions, the green transition and the digital transition, also the demographic transition which is coming down the road, which will require major adaptation. If we don't take care of these things, we'll see that these savings of a few billion will lead to high levels of spending in 10, 15, 20 years' time. So we need to take a systemic look at what debt is useful for. Debt is merely the difference between revenue and spending. If the debt is useful for investment, because a structural debt can be used to create new infrastructure, creating future value, it's useful debt. If, on the other hand, the debt is used to make up for unbalanced current spending, it can leave outside of a period of crisis, of course. That is a type of debt, conjunctural debt, which shouldn't be created because it lasts too long, and it has lasted for too long in our countries. We need to ensure that debt generates value, economic value, ecological value, social value. The question is to think about how all communities and all territories can access this value creation to ensure that the collective effort provided by the issuance of public debt is properly distributed. Otherwise, the future is going to get more and more difficult. What I think we lack is indicators to properly drive that in a climate of trust between citizens and the public authorities, between the business and economic stakeholders and the civil society stakeholders and the public authorities. Currently, in the indicators and the metrics that we have, all we talk about is GDP, and GDP does have a certain advantage. It's a very comprehensive financial indicator, but there are positive and negative externalities which are not taken into account. We take into account things that pollute the environment as well as things that protect health. So the impact in terms of well-being and health and the environment is not necessarily the same in these two elements. So I think what we need is more nuanced metrics that help with public decision-making, which will give some feedback to our communities. I think that's the only way that we'll be able to manage debt in a democratic and responsible way. So let's think about that solution, and we're going to move on to Jakob von WEIZSÄCKER. We could say that too high levels of indebtedness are rather incompatible with what we might refer to as the credibility of the European Union. What's your opinion on that point? Inviting a German person like me to talk about debt is a little bit of a caricature in some ways. And I might perhaps start by saying that between France and Germany, if we look over the last few years, things might have gone better if the taxation and fiscal policy in Germany had been a bit more French style, and if the fiscal and taxation policy in French had been managed a little bit in a little bit more Germanic manner. You can see very clearly from what I'm saying that there is no single truth as regards to taxation policy and fiscal policy. Nonetheless, public debt may be an indicator of a deeper lying problem, an indicator of policy making that is too short-termist in perspective. A short-term policy doesn't invest significantly enough in things like infrastructure, in natural capital, in climate change mitigation, in human capital. And we see that we're consuming too much resources, we're not investing enough, and the overall debt level is too high. And that, as a whole, leads to a situation which, not necessarily in the very short term, but in the medium and long term, is a bad thing for the country. On the other hand, if we invest enough and we take good care of public finances, that doesn't mean no debt. If the debt is used for good projects, Moody's is not going to come and punish us. Moody's will say that's a good thing to do, keep going. But unfortunately, and this is not something that's to do with cause and effect, this is just about correlation. We often see that fiscal short-termism and a short-term approach to investments are positively correlated. That shouldn't necessarily be the case. If I follow on from what some of the previous speakers have said, one key thing to look at between the public sector and the private sector is whether public investments have an effect to crowd in private investment, or whether they push out the private investment. And the fact that because the government is investing, perhaps the private sector wouldn't be interested in investing. That's something that can be quantified. It's something that you can look at. Are we operating with a good method which attracts new investment, or a way that pushes out new investment? So when we think about demographic issues, the fact that the population is aging, but people are refusing to work for a little bit longer, just a small percentage of their increased life expectancy, that can be an example of something that would create this effect of pushing out private sector. The aging issue in France is even more serious in Germany than in France. That's why I mention it. Gérard BEKERMAN, for you, debt credibility is very important. If we want to reduce debt, there are some ways forward, but perhaps not all of them are the right ones. Some of the things mentioned by members of parliament in France recently might not have been the best idea. I'm from Alsace, and I like to hear what the German minister has just said, but I am actually French, so I want to encourage you to come towards us, and that will be the effect of attraction, and I'll leave the crowding out effect to you. So members of parliament should stay where they are, particularly right now in the current political climate in France. Members of parliament don't have the same message with regard to debt. Our members of parliament have been incapable of voting for balanced budgets for decades. They have only been agreeing on budgets with deficits. Our members of parliament are feeding on the debt, whereas we as free savers and investors who work all our lives, just as our parents and grandparents did, to save up, we are getting poorer and poorer with our country's debt. The difference when a state issues borrowing, I'm not talking about the non-mobilizable debt, as people say, which represents 450 billion, but all of the freely tradable debt. I'm saying that this is not a good thing, because what it means for millions of French people who have saved money over their lifetime, it's a very fortunate thing to be able to save up. It means that you're not using up all of your income in current everyday spending. Not all French people, millions of French people don't have this opportunity. And this leads to a situation where trust is turning into distrust, security is turning to insecurity, and contentedness, or the consent to taxation, is increasingly lost. That's a situation that we need to avoid. In the early 20th century, when income tax was introduced, it was never supposed to be a redistributive tax. So we weren't thinking about social justice. At the time, members of parliament said that there should be a proportional tax rather than progressive tax. It was much later, as CHENUT said earlier, that the concern for ensuring that tax has these helicopter pilots don't like me, it looks like, that our tax should have a redistributive and social justice role. I wouldn't say it's secondary, but it came in second place behind the major state responsibilities for defending the territory, education and health. These are key state prerogatives which justify national debt. And I would add that if a country like France has a rate of indebtedness above the level at which it's creating wealth, 110% of the GDP, and the deficit, which is 5.5%. That's not quite so serious. A deficit is a small flow, but a debt is a big stock. The deficit feeds into the debt level. So when I say that a country has got to the stage where it's creating more debt than it's creating in wealth, this is a very serious situation. We shouldn't penalise savers and investors who are making the effort to not be behind with their payments. If I don't repay my debts, I will be prosecuted. But if a national government doesn't repay its debt, as is its habit, we only service the debt, we only pay the interest on the debt. French people are paying 53 to 55 billion euros in debt service payments. So I say we need to set limits to the progress, the growth in debt. And I think that debt is the enemy of trust and growth.
Do you agree with that? So I would like you to react. So let's go to the solutions now. Sarah, the debt is an enemy for trust, for growth. What solution should, or when we understand the trajectory, what can we do now?
Well, I've explained what our role in the market is, but what our role in the financial market is not, is to give policy advice. But what I can say is that, there have been a few comments on the panel talking about, perhaps it's not the level, it's the trajectory of the debt.
Parlez bien dans le micro, ça.
Excusez-moi. It's both the level and the trajectory. Because if you think about what the disadvantages of not reducing your debt are, so that means not just remaining stable, because after all, crises will come, and crises cost different amounts, but très souvent ils coûtent très très cher. And so what we think about is also the cost of not making that policy choice, because everything we've been talking about on this panel is about prioritization and choices. And it is a choice to not reduce debt. And what does that mean? It means, we've just been hearing about the cost of interest. It means that that can potentially crowd out investment spending. It also means that if your debt level remains elevated, even if it's stable, you then remain vulnerable to increases in interest rates. I mean, we don't think that interest rates are going back to where they were before Russia invaded Ukraine. And so this is a new normal of higher interest rates, which means that the interest bill gets higher. But I think there's also this question about margin of maneuver and having shock absorption capacity. One of the things that reducing debt, making difficult choices, sometimes politically difficult choices, and I'm not here to tell any government what those choices should be, but not making those choices means that you don't have that margin of maneuver when the next crisis comes to be able to absorb it. Without causing a further increase, potentially a quasi-permanent increase in the debt level. And so that's the way we think about it at Moody's, is we think about if debt rises, can a government bring it back down again and rebuild that shock absorption capacity? We talk a lot about that because the time horizons we think about are long. And that's why you can, during a time of crisis like COVID, see debt levels rise. But one of the things we said very early on during the pandemic crisis was something that's important is what governments choose to do next. And when that debt has risen, is it coming back down again? And in some countries in Europe, countries outside of Europe, we are actually seeing debt levels come down, in some cases coming down very quickly from some countries where you might not have expected it. You know, the Greek debt level is falling very quickly. The Portuguese debt level is falling very quickly. Cyprus, these were countries that were in crisis over 10 years ago. But following that crisis, following difficult choices, they then have that margin of maneuver to be able to come through a crisis period.
Ok, j'aimerais qu'on vous entende, Salim. Je vous voyais réagir par rapport à ce que disait Sarah. Donc, on va terminer ce tour de table pour passer après assez vite à vos.
So let's move on to your question, Salim. Now we want to hear you. We want to hear you react. So get ready for your questions. So Salim, versus what Sarah just said and your own solutions. Well, I'll try to raise the discussion taking advantage of what Sarah just said. In the Arab world, often we talk about Middle East and North Africa, MENA. We got the worst stories of two worlds, the oil importing country and then the oil exporting country, the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the others. During the COVID period, most of the countries of the world, as we experienced in Europe and the US, had to provide financial support to the households, to this, to the companies. But we were in a situation of economic shock. So activities were going through a status quo. There was no activity. From then on, the only way we could finance such financial aid or support was through debt, public debt. Whereas the GDP was dropping, the debt ratio versus the ratio debt versus GDP increased. Then after 2021, with so many oil exporting countries readjust their ratio and drop the ratios, while the importing countries were still struggling with high ratios. But now, if we look at the composition of the debt, and this is the most important point in public debt, when we look at the composition of the debt in the Arab world, it is more and more financed by internal rather than external. So this is an economic, the sovereign and the bank, the nexus, the sovereign bank nexus means that the money from the savers, are exposed to the state risk. If the state has a risk with its budget and its budgetary rest, so the risk of deterioration of rating or pose another problem is that the bank deposit will be exposed to risk. There is a country in the exposure to risk is in excess of 50–60%. That's the example of Lebanon. Just before the Lebanese crisis in 2019, about 70% of savings was directly or indirectly invested into state bonds. And when the crisis hit, the country entered a total blockage, economically speaking. Banks could not recover their money from the state, and in that respect were not able to give the money back to the people who contributed to the deposit. And it's been 5 years now. The state has no solution, but private sector is fine. They're producing, especially in services. But unfortunately, because there is no state, There is a high unemployment rate, a cash economy, but we also have old infrastructures and public services which are totally down. So what we're trying to do is to convince the political class to find a solution with international debt holder, the IMF, to group and to help us restart the economic machine together with the private sector. Gérard BEKERMAN. Of course, this is not the case of Lebanon in France, but you know, high debt, it's important, you said it, but for life insurance, for your domain, you're president of the affair, but it's important to have this high debt for your sector. Life insurance is 1,900 billion. This life insurance pays lots, renders a lot of services to the states. Half of our debt, public debt, domestic public debt, I'm excluding the 55% of the 3 billion, you know, subscribed by non-residents, you know. So half of this remaining part, it's us, life insurance. So when I say it's us, what does it mean? It means like it's 22 million of French citizens who've worked hard to get to save money, and the managers of insurance companies invest in public paper. And it is a call, a strong call I'm sending to the future members of parliament. If you don't want us to finance the public debt, well, if you want us to continue financing the public debt, stop taxing life insurance. If you tax life insurance, you're going to tax hospitals, roads, schools, healthcare, ecological transition, and sustainable development. Leave us alone. We don't need members of parliament who will tax once more life insurance, which is the perfect savings to face all the problems of life. Eric CHENUT, what are your solutions? We heard you talk about the importance of debt, multiple debt. You mentioned that, not just financial, but it is also, which has other aspects. So today, what should we do to follow this trajectory of debt reduction? Well, first, we need to pull out of the budgetary adjustment. You know, the FSS, which are not allowed the players, be it the stakeholders, I'm talking for me, of the healthcare systems, to project themselves, to plan the necessary adaptation. So we have to reason in terms of pluriannualities, planning or programmation plans, and this is something that today our regulatory legal frameworks do not facilitate. But mainly there is a short-termism which has been installed on the public power, which does not facilitate things. Second element, I like what Gérard BEKERMAN said early on when we talked about the consent or content for tax on social contribution. The last major systemic reform made in our country for tax was 35 years ago. It was the CSG. Well, general social contribution. Well, the Rocard government realized that it will not be sustainable because of the demography if we keep financing everything on social and employers' contributions. So we need a fiscal dimension. So they started this major transformation. Today, 35 years later, we are 35 years later, but we are not anticipating the shift of today. We got 1.7 active for a pensioner. It will be 1.2 for one pensioner. So we will not be able to keep financing this social system with increasing need, with the modes of action today. We know we're going to increase the debt, and as one stage we won't be able to, we will keep de-investing, and therefore we will generate inequalities and cost as well, additional cost. So if we don't plan and if we don't transform the modalities of funding, we will have difficult times. So we have to go outside of the financing. And so what can we do? What can we do? Well, we need to verify the relevance of prescription. We have to go to more opposable prescriptions, a sort of a good prescription, you know, based on the recommendations from the recommendation of the health high authority on health. They do preconization on lots of pathologies. You know, let's avoid redundant care treatment, and we'll avoid additional costs by doing this type of transformation, systemic transformation from the prescriptors, and change the culture from the population. We could save 10 to 20 million euros on healthcare expenditures. This will be indispensable if we want to be able to absorb and amortize the cost that will change because of the aging of population in the coming years. Can we make it? Can we do it? Well, depends on the political courage, depends on the ability to explain that to the population, because there are changes of habit and mobilization of healthcare professionals. In the case of the last medical convention, doctors commit themselves to improve prescription, efficiency of prescription. Well, let's create the conditions with the patients' association, with public authorities, because we will have to all get together to do the job. We'll have to pull out of our habits if we want this change to be feasible. If we don't do that, there will be, cuts in expenditures, and it will be worse. Of course, it will be worse, and it will not be less expensive. For the last 30 years, we're doing accounting, arbitration, short-termist, technocratic, and we've seen the result. It does not meet the systemic needs and the needs of the population. So we have to pull out of this, otherwise, tomorrow, a huge segment of the healthcare system that will be taxed, we've seen it in the EHPADs, on the pensionist home, in a kindergarten, or dental pathology, So we have to pay attention that if tomorrow we want to guarantee access to healthcare for the population, everywhere and for everybody, and at sustainable level for the businesses, for the social contributors. Long way to go. Jakob von Weizsäcker. So the debt for you, it has to be analyzed, adapted to each country. What do you think of what has been said? Then we'll move on to the questions. Let's try to answer your question with an example experienced myself. Saar is a highly industrialized region, the steel industry, the automotive industry, and quite intensive, job intensive. And to decarbonize, there is a huge challenge. So I proposed, as Minister of Finance, to create a fund to finance through the debt, and possibly a bit like in the spirit you mentioned, Jean-Paul's proposal, yes. And I was surprised that there was a lot of enthusiasm for that. Why were you surprised? But enthusiasm did not come from the fact that it could finance investment in innovation, in infrastructures, for economic decarbonized economic activities. But there were a lot of players in the region who thought that they would transfer all the budget investment that we were going to make anyway to get more space within the budget for consumption, for consumers. And it was a battle. It's been a political battle to ensure that we would create the funds for investment which were necessary, and we would increase the investment rate in the very budgets. And fortunately, we're able to do it. But it's very, very difficult. Why is it difficult? Because we could say, okay, what would be the basic reason? Why didn't we invest enough before in some domains? The answer is simple. Political forces, lobbies, were short-termist, and they were for consumption. They were not for expenditure that will provide long-term yields. So if through that you give more fund to the system, they will do exactly the same thing as they were doing before. They will spend the funds in a short-termist manner. So if we don't stop that logic, honestly, the additional debt will not lead to gross miracles. It will lead to the situation you are criticizing. We'll end up with more debt and not much to show in 5 or 10 years. And this is the basic problem. And I am very happy that we've been able to transform our fiscal rules in the European Union to have a closer look at the quality of public expenditures. And I think it's a good approach, and I hope it will help the member states in France and Germany to continue more the quality of expenditures and not just the quantity of expenditures. I think we have a question here in the first row. Yes, indeed. Please introduce yourself. Jeanberg, teacher, essayist. Listen to Michel Kantz's years ago. He says the long-term debt will be erased either by general bankrupt to see, or hyperinflation or war. So the question I'm putting, which is quite provocative, Russian debt, you know it, 12.5% of the GDP, tens of hours. I'm not saying that Putin went into war with the low debt rate, but he wants to keep going. So the question maybe is out of your competence. We in the West, who need to increase the armament expenditures, can we sustain this military competition by increasing by 1 or 2% GDP in the armament, and if we do it to the detriment of what? So for you, finance, well, you don't, well, last thing, I read the memoirs of Frederick the Great, who made a huge Weltanschauung. He describes the internal situation. It doesn't start with he says to have a sovereign policy, independent, you need healthy finances. I'm not saying that it explains the victory or the defeat in 1970, but there's something there in the topic. Thank you. Who would like to respond to this? Okay. Gérard? Well, when a minister doesn't want to answer, you can't ask a citizen to reply. Another question. Okay, one thing. I do believe your friend with the first expression, he was wrong. Usually war leads to debt. It does not destroy debt. It does not erase debt. Wars are very costly. It costs a lot of money. And usually it's neither feasible nor reasonable to increase taxes to such a point that we could pay for a war. So in that respect, the third way to erase a debt is it is an erroneous analysis of history. But when we look at this question, so how could we help Ukraine in the war? Well, there is a simple answer. Our economy in Europe, European economy, and if we look only at the European Union, we are so much higher than the Russian economy that there will be no problem to finance the war. But we have to ask ourselves the question, do we finance it through reassignment of resources within the budget, or do we do a less partial financing through debt? Well, another question, take advantage. Sir? Please introduce yourself. Eric de Mornac, entrepreneur. A question about the debt rate, which is the topic of this discussion. We got a debt rate of 120%. European treaty limited to 60%. 110, okay, 110. 112, okay. Well, it was thought about Monday morning. I was thinking about the end of the year. Greece, 2008, 170. So what is our percentage of chance? What is our percentage of chance? Because the two insurers are... So how can we have a situation such as Greece in 2008? Sarah.
Attempt to answer your question because I was actually the analyst for Greece at Moody's when it defaulted. So I would say a couple of things. First of all, the situation between that France is in is very different. If I were to do a comparison between the two, the economy of France is much stronger. If you think about the fundamental business model of the French economy, it's much stronger. The institutions are certainly much stronger. If you think about the ability to collect tax, which is a pretty fundamental part of government institutions, orders of magnitude stronger than what was the case in Greece. And then, of course, you had very significant event risks. You had a significant current account deficit. You spoke earlier about the bank sovereign nexus. There were issues with that in Greece as well, though it wasn't the fundamental cause of the crisis. So I would say there are very, very important differences to bear in mind between the two countries. The other thing I would say is that there are no magic numbers. When a country's debt level passes 100% of GDP, we often get asked, like, so what does that mean? And you're like, well, it kind of depends on what else is going on in the economy. Japan's creditworthiness is perfectly well intact. It has a very high debt level. It can finance that, in part because it finances itself primarily at home. So, and there are some countries, we're experts on this. We study defaults. And there are countries who default with debt levels at actually quite low levels. So there's not one magic number. I would say it depends on what else is going on in the economy, in the institutions. Fundamentally, the way we think about it is the stronger an economy, the stronger the institutions, the higher the debt level is. That's actually sustainable. That's actually hard-baked into our analytical approach, our methodology. And then, of course, you think about susceptibility to event risks, the banking sector being an important one in advanced economies.
Merci, merci Sarah. On prend peut-être une dernière question, après on va écouter.
One last question, then we listen to Jean-Paul. Listen to Jean-Paul. One last question. Sir? Okay, let's take the two questions. The French debt is 3,100 billion. Before the COVID, a few years ago, it was at 2,000 billion. So the 1,000 billion, what happened? Okay, 2,000 billion was COVID. What about the rest? What does it come from? This is a great question. Let's stop looking for excuses, adjuvants. One day we said it was the subprime crisis. Then we were told that it was the, what you've just said, the COVID. But that's not that. Let's look at the real reasons. And mainly, of course, the COVID, but the COVID or the subprime crisis. We'll find a third one, don't worry, in a couple of days. That's not the point. It's the inability of the people of the political to hold a balanced budget. Because if we gave the businesses or the citizens, we give them oxygen to breathe, we would be ready to play the game of integration, of major societal challenges. As President CHENUT said on the healthcare, healthcare is the first vector for growth in countries. And when I hear this member of parliament, what's her name, who said, Sandrine Rousseau, who says, I will seize all savings, but madam, when you are a member of parliament, you got the duty to set the law. This money is not yours, it is our money. How can you dare say, I will seize the money, the insurance life money, 2,000 billion. She's not allowed to say this. Those are radical situations. Let's think, as we've done in a very positive way today, about the possible solutions. Jean-Paul, Pollin, to conclude the session rapidly. Highly complicated because a lot of topics have been discussed in different viewpoints. So I don't have the feeling that I will have everything to conclude. What I want to say is that this roundtable was more consensual than what I expected. Of course, there's been no real discussions or no contradictory controversy, but 2 points, nevertheless, which I think are important to remember. First, the issue of short-termism, which is indeed important. It is true that when we vote budget once every year, we are myopic when about the consequences thereof in the long term, and this we know we have to do something about that. Second thing, credibility. It is important indeed that when decisions are being made, it should be done in full knowledge of the situation, not by hiding a certain number of facts, and especially the conjuncture, because, of course, the context, because government commits itself as of based on conjunctural data which are not discussed or challenged, and there should be counterpowers. In principle, the Court of Auditors and the High Council of Public Finances, but one and the other are fairly, well, we can't hear them. They don't have power to constrain from a given way, and what they say is not impacted, is not disseminated enough. So possibly it will be important for this credibility, is what Jakob said early on about the debt, German debt, which actually was highly criticized at the time. It was said the Germans are hiding part of the debt under the carpet. So, whereas in fact, the idea was that to make the credible the expenditures, which were expenditures which had to be for investment. So this problem of credibility has not been solved. We have to give more power, especially to the Public Finance Council, as in the UK. Thank you.
Pour votre participation.